So I'm Drew Bennett. I'm the director of the software licensing practice here at Michigan, and I'm out of the Office of Innovation Partnerships, previously Tech Transfer. The purpose of my part of the presentation is to set some context for what I will call a combination of institutional rules in the context of what Aaron just talked about in the NIH guidance, and then really what I'm going to say is a combination of policy and practice. If you walk out of this part of the discussion with nothing else, there's policy, and then there's practice, and then there's attempting to try and make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs along the way with the process. So this is a very big topic, and what I will tell you is that generally speaking, when I do this presentation, it's an hour-long presentation. We do it all the time. It is kind of a mix of a primer on open source and U of M policy. What I will tell you is I've been in the software business for 30 years. I've been involved with open source software for 30 years. And what the NIH policy does not say is that you have to release everything open source. So when I hear people say that, I become deeply concerned, because Aaron mentioned something in particular that's super important to keep in mind. It's institutional rules, sounds pretty heavy, kind of go to the top with respect to how you manage code. So I'm just trying to set a bit of a background on some open source basics for people. If it's redundant for you, you know it all, you can just take a nap. If it's news to you or it's helpful, then that's great. And then talk a little bit about the licensing side of open source and the relationship to U of M policy. So hopefully all that is valuable to everybody. Open source has been around for a long, long time. I always laugh when I think about Steve Ballmer's comment when he was like, open source is going to crush, basically IP and the business of software. And you have on the counter end of that, Richard Stallman is the person who founded the Free Software Foundation, is the author of the GNU GPL license series. And then, of course, it wouldn't make any sense if we didn't have something about academics. But there's a high contrast set of beliefs on it. The reality is now it's just standard practice. This is how business is done. This is how software is managed in a large number of cases. But when we talk about an open source license is what's referred to technically as a passive conditional license that's applied to code. Nobody signs anything. Nobody passes a document back and forth. None of that has happened. There's a license that sits with the repository of the code you're going to take or that's going to be released. And those are the conditions under which you assume use of that code. It's interesting to note, I've been in tech transfer at Michigan for 12 years, and probably one of the highest litigated spaces in the software side now is open source. So it's not like, hey, kind of do what you want. It's a general suggestion. People are very serious about this, and appreciating and understanding it are super important if you're going to work in space. And it really is a license to source. We get people who get this wrong all the time, but this is actual editable foundational code, and the licensing and the use of open source is that. It's not a compiled executable, and this is the same intention of the NIH policy, is for people to have access to that, not a compiled version of it. By definition, open source is software making the source code available, and the copyright holder, the person who created it, basically is saying, I'm giving you the rights to look at it in detail, to change it, modify it, redistribute under some set of circumstances, and let it be out there. It's important to note there's two ways of thinking about it. And they're both appropriate, and there's not one right answer, but people will talk about open source and say, well, it's free. And they tend to get it wrong in the sense of free. They want to think no cost. That can be an aspect of how it's done. It's free as in open and accessible is the primary driver of it. And there is no governing body that is managing open source. Another thing that tends to get confused by a lot of people is there's some nebulous person in the sky, OSI or the Free Software Foundation or somebody else that's overseeing this. They are not. OSI is a collaboration, or the Open Source Initiative is a collaboration of a lot of people interested in open source. They have historically vetted and approved a series of licenses that you're probably familiar with if you work in the space. Free Software Foundation doing something similar, but they aren't a governing body. There isn't somebody governing it. They're just kind of a coalition of interested folks. As a sidebar, and this comes up a lot, we have people say Creative Commons. Well, I'm going to release my code under Creative Commons. Again, if you take nothing else away from this conversation today, Creative Commons is not a license that you use on software code. If you want to look like you kind of don't know what's going on, put a Creative Commons license on your software code, and people will go, maybe they don't know what they're doing. And if you read the Creative Commons website, which is a set of open access or open source licenses for content, they explicitly point you right back to OSI and say you should use one of the OSI licenses. So again, there's a bunch of these different folks who are out there, and they're good for different reasons. Creative Commons is phenomenal if you have content that you're going to release and you want to do it in an open way. I strongly encourage it. And then OSI is a great resource. It has all of the OSI quote approved licenses, and they've been approved by a committee. They have not added a ton of licenses in the last 10 or 15 years because most of the ones that folks use have been out there for a long, long time. There's 70 plus approved licenses. It's everything from licenses that you're probably familiar with or have heard of, the Apache license, the BSD license, the MIT license, the GPL licenses. If you want to get really crazy, they have a fun license in there called the free beer license. So you can find a license to basically meet any need you want. You'll hear me say this later. The reality is there's about 7 licenses that should cover 95% of any situation that you're trying to address. There's fundamentally 3 things that a license is telling you about. It's basically telling you what you, or an open source license is telling you about. There's basically telling you what you can do, what are the things you can do with this code, things you cannot do, and things you must do. There's a really good site, and I have some references at the end of the presentation that you can get to. It's called TLDR Legal. It's a site that I helped with many years ago that's now been taken over by another group that basically explains pretty much every primary open source license. Really good, quick summarization website. But most of the open source licenses really kind of fit into 2 primary groups. What's called a highly permissive license allows you tons of flexibility up to and including the ability to make the code that you've developed or modified closed source, or if you pick it up. So that's the Apache, the BSD and MIT licenses. And then there's what's called the strong copy left licenses. It's a little bit confusing in nomenclature, but it's a GPL and AGPL license. You'll hear some people who don't like those style licenses refer to them as highly viral. And there's certain companies and organizations that won't allow you to use any code that has a GPL or an AGPL license on it because the nature of the way that license works, which basically means anybody who combines another work with it has to release it under that license. And then the LGPL is kind of a middle step on that with respect to limited access or limited restrictions. And again, this is just an absolute screen grab from that site. It's the can, can't, and can't do. When I talk about can on a permissive license, one of the things that people love about permissive licenses like MIT and the Apache are you can commercialize it, you can privatize it, and use it as you will. All you have to do is on the must side, make sure you include the copyright of the original creator. The primary impetus behind open source is basically attribution. The value to the community and the person publishing the license is to make it accessible to people under the proviso that you can look at the family tree and understand where it came from. That's what's required in pretty much every open source license. And the other thing they'll ask for you to do is pretty much 100% of the time include the original license. So you know what the terms were if you wanted to map your way back. And on those licenses, the fine print is the part that becomes super important. So the highlighted parts here, the MIT license, which is basically those 2 paragraphs in a sentence. The big thing is you have to include the copyright notice. Again, know where it came from. And then you start getting into the other licenses and they get a lot more specific in a big hurry. And understanding and appreciating those things becomes important because it's telling you what you have to do. Notice provisions in the Apache license are important ones. And if you go back to the prior slide, the Apache license is basically saying you got to state your changes. So when you make a modification to the Apache underlying code, you're supposed to have a notice file that basically tells people what you did so they can understand the differences between the original and the modification. So those things become super important. Having the compliance pieces available, this is where people are unfortunately getting nasty letters and visits from attorneys, which basically says, you didn't do this. You didn't include the copyright notice. You didn't include the license. You didn't include the changes. Having that stuff together becomes super important. Where it is becomes important. Generally speaking, it's either going to have to be in your distribution, so your Git repo, or it's going to have to be readily available on the site where you can find it. It's better if it goes with the distribution, but people tend to miss on these things, and it is problematic if you do it. And again, there's the much more restrictive licenses that have a number of things on the must side that become particularly important. And those must things, generally speaking, are you have to continue to come under the same license if you combine it with another work. So if you take part A and part B and put it together, that's when things start to roll. So very important parts of it, you must license the entire work as a whole under the license to anyone who comes in possession of a copy. And the license basically has to be the same as the original license. And that's where you get people talking about the GNU or the GPL license being considered viral. Again, the fine points are the points that become super important. So, as I mentioned, basically it's keeping it open and free. And that Stallman was pretty much his MO or his foundational belief is I don't want anyone ever to be able to lock this up. And because of that, that's the nature of the way the licenses are built. So the question always becomes for people, well, I have some GPL code and I want to mix it my project and then I want to do something else. Well, what does that mean? Becomes super, super complicated in a big hurry. When you combine things, when you merge things, what happens? So I have my proprietary software, the yellow blocks. I want to combine that with a permissive license. What happens? Or I want to create a derivative work or a modification of a permissive piece of software. What happens? Or I want to combine something that has a weak copyleft component with a bunch of proprietary stuff. What happens? These are the combinations that appreciating and understanding become hugely important. Because again, those copyleft licenses or highly restrictive licenses have a ton of inheritance. They become super, super important to comply with. I'm going to go through a couple of quick examples here. Again, you can look at this after the fact, but when you bring in a component that has that permissive license into something else you've built, the yellow blocks, and it's got that very permissive license, you can release that any way you want, up to and including proprietary. So when you bring it in, as long as you meet those copyright applications and the notice requirements, you're good to go. So your release product on the right can be proprietary. It doesn't have to be. You can release it MIT, you can release it Apache, etc. You can even release it under a more restrictive license like GPL. Then we have people who talk about, I have this component, I'm going to make modification of that component, also known as derivative work, and I want to release that. If that thing was originally under a permissive license, you can do that again. No problem whatsoever. I just blew by one, sorry about that. So the LGPL example is the one that's worth people appreciating, which is those weak copyleft licenses. So the LGPL says that isolated chunk that you brought together, as long as it's fundamentally separable from the balance, you can take that work and combine it, and you can license that work with the combination under whatever licensing you want. But that component has to remain under that same license. Same thing, you come out and want to do the modification or derivative work of the LGPL component. When you do that, you have to release that under the same LGPL license. Then finally, the copyleft integration. So this is the GPL licenses or the PL family, GPL and AGPL. If you combine that with something else, it's going to go under a GPL license. It's going to go under an AGPL license. Wherever it started is where it's going to continue, and super important to appreciate that. If you combine it with other things that are yours or other things that are permissive, it's still going to be released under a strong copyleft, either GPL or AGPL license. Same thing happens if you're creating a derivative of only one component, stays the same as a strong copyleft license. So really important, you've got to redistribute the original source that you received. You have to include those copyright and license text files, and you have to provide equivalent access to the source code. Bottom line, you cannot do anything to restrict access to it when you get into a restricted license. So we get this question all the time. I grabbed a GPL component and I want to do something proprietary with it. I want to close it. Well, the short answer is what you see here. You can take it out, you can rewrite it, you can attempt to relicense the component if the original creator will allow you to do that, or you can release it copyleft. Those are the only options you have. So it's either get rid of it, redo it, get a license to it, or license it under the terms they told you they want you to do it. So another question that happens all the time with people is IP protection when it comes to open source. If you are somebody pursuing intellectual property protection with our office, namely in the form of a patent, you're not going to go open source. It doesn't make any sense. And there happens to be a couple of really serious problems with it. Many of the open source licenses have explicit patent grants. Several of them have what are considered to be inferred patent grants, which basically means if you release your code under that, you're fundamentally forfeiting your patent. This is hugely important. I had a horrible story where I had a PI go through a long patenting exercise of something that was highly sophisticated and really valuable to them. We filed that patent on Monday. On Friday, that PI's GSRA released that code via GitHub with a GPL free license, and their patent went away like that. It was over with instantaneously. 5 days after they had filed it, it was gone. Because inside the license of the GPL version 3 basically says if any of the methods or approaches identified or expressed in this code are subject to a patent, you are giving me a free patent grant. You're giving me a free patent license. So bottom line, if you're going to patent, you're not going to do open source because they just don't go together. I mentioned this earlier and trying to make sure we have enough time at the end, but practically speaking, you really should be able to license almost everything under 7 licenses: the Apache license, the BSD license, and the MIT license on the permissive side, and then the GPL licenses on the copyleft side. And the reason why is these are all very well known. They're extremely familiar to most people. They're exceptionally well supported. People know how they work. They're clear and unambiguous, and therefore they cover off on most of the cases that you would use. There is a additional license that applies very specifically to academic settings, especially in a case where somebody's telling you, I have to release code potentially relating to a publication or in support of open science. And we're 100% behind that, but it's important to understand that U of M's policy is that software developed under grants is owned by the university. It's very clear. It's in the SBG, it's in the tech transfer policy, it's in the Regents bylaw. This is unambiguous. That software developed at the university within grants or within your job is owned by the university. So does that mean the university is going to decide in every single case what happens to it if you want to release it open source? The answer is, of course, no, and kind of goes to the last item here, which is we're not operating in a policing function. We're trying to operate in a co-stewardship function with you to ensure that you are compliant with the requirements of your grant, that your project is evaluated in terms of its forward approach with respect to intellectual property, which may include just completely releasing it open source, And then trying to help you navigate things like the Open Science Initiative, the open data requirements from NIH in combination with the U of M policy. It is more of a sequencing question than it is a no, never question. And there are many ways to allow you to do both, to have open access, especially when it comes to academic partners and research partners, as well as preserving potential commercialization opportunities. One of the key and interesting things relative to the NIH and NSF and the rest of the federal agencies is in 1980, the federal law called Bayh-Dole was initiated, which fundamentally gave universities and research institutions the rights to manage intellectual property developed under federal grants. They want the university, where appropriate and where it makes sense, to work with collaboration partners, either commercially or otherwise, to get these things to the public for impact. And that is the sequencing thing, that's the first discussion is there an opportunity for this to potentially have specific intellectual property benefits that we might be able to license and then lead to commercial impact? Or is it something that's better served as an open access, open source type of project? The Polyform project, which is a more contemporary form of licensing than any of the licenses I talked before, has what's called a non-commercial dual use license, which basically allows you to share the code in the right sequencing with other collaborators, meet your NIH and open data requirements while also preserving commercial opportunities. There's a lot going on in this space. It is highly active. There is no right answer. There's only a right answer for your situation. And that just requires each of those to be looked at closely. So bottom line, summary of all this stuff, and that was a lot of stuff to take on in a short period of time, so I appreciate that. Use a known OSI license and work with us to help you decide if there's a different licensing strategy that might make sense for the goals of the project and the contributors and the contents. Make sure you understand when you're mixing things together, what obligations kind of trump other obligations, and then really understand what are the key drivers. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to get more contributors? Are we trying to get better distribution? Do you really just want it to be freely available? Are we trying to consider commercial use or upstream applications? All those things are part of it. But the bottom line is we're trying to simplify that process for everybody by having a conversation that talks to all of those pieces. So bottom line is, I was telling people, what you think you know probably can hurt you. And there's lots and lots of resources on campus, not the least of which is in our office to help you navigate a bunch of stuff that I just told you in very short order. So I can appreciate it just gets complicated and people like, my head's going to explode. You just told me a whole bunch of stuff in a very short order. There's an entire wing inside of my group, which we call MOS, which is the Michigan Open Software Initiative, that does nothing but basically work with projects and teams on an open source consulting basis. So what are we trying to do with the project? I have these obligations with respect to my sponsor. I think I want to release it this way. I've used these types of licenses. Can you help me with compliance? We're trying to develop a community. We've done a tremendous amount of work in the last 2 years on grant support for the NSF POSE grant, the Sloan grants, NASA grants. There's tons of grants now very focused on open access and open source. Done versions of this presentation and education with groups, and we're willing to do that anywhere, anytime anybody wants. Doing a tremendous amount of promotion and awareness building for projects so that people can build those communities and have people actively involved with that stuff. And late in 2024, we're releasing the first version of the MOS portfolio, which is basically every open source project that we can get our arms around at Michigan and helping to promote that. So there's a single location to at least start at. It's not trying to create a single Git repo. It's a single kind of web presence as to where all these projects are at. So if you're interested in that, let us know. There's that email address that will get you to all the right people in our group. I always tell people there's a couple of great resources. They are as listed here. there's a great book if you really want to geek out on open source, and it is this book by Heather Meeker, who I've known for a long time. She's the source for open source information. So if it's something you just really can't get enough of, I highly recommend it. That TLDR site is an outstanding site to learn more about open source licenses. The Choose a License site is a really good site if you're trying to work through some ideas on it. And then, of course, reaching out to our office.